Look, okay, I know I'm talking about a show that's been out of print since 2015. I'm more aware of that fact than you will ever know. But doing what I do here on YouTube, knowing what I know about the world of darkness, there's a price that I pay. A part of my brain, my mind, my very soul, if you will, that I had to sacrifice to play host to an eye-shaped eldritch entity. And it sees all I see, hears all I hear, which it can do because it is eldritch, and it's an eye, so it can hear as well. And it whispers to me about everything, which it can also do because it's eldritch. And it's trying to make sense of every show, and every film, and everything that happens to me in real fucking life in the context of World of Darkness. There's no more media for me, really. Everything is just World of Darkness cinematic universe. Everything, especially if it's set in like the real world or some approximation thereof, I work into World of Darkness, unless it's specifically about like vampires or werewolves. I can't help it. It's my curse, and in the interest of solidarity, I'm gonna make you all share part of that burden. I've recently been rewatching the 2013 television show Hannibal with my girlfriend, because it's her favorite show, and also because it's a really good show. I did see most of it years ago, back when it came out, and sort of lost interest at some point in season 3, but now I have watched it all again, and having since been infected with the World of Darkness brainworms, 3 things became immediately apparent to me. This show is set in the World of Darkness and easily spans most of its game lines. Will Graham is a mage. Dr. Hannibal Lecter is a fairy. No, not in the sense that he's gay. He's clearly gay and bisexual. He's just also a changeling. And if that sounds weird to you, stick around because my evidence is overwhelming. And if you're a Hannibal fan, you've stumbled on this, hello? You probably don't know what the fuck I'm talking about, so welcome to this little sort of sidebar area. I'll try to make this make sense to you. This whiteboard is just perfunctory. I've forgotten where the pens are. I can't find them, so I'll just use, you know, Photoshop to make things appear here as I explain them, and hopefully I won't step in front of it. Basically, there is this vast and extensive tabletop role-playing game universe called World of Darkness, and you may have heard of Vampire the Masquerade. That's part of this universe, but there's way more, and I'm going to analyze the TV show with Matt Mikkelsen and Hugh Dancy as if it were part of that universe, because holy shit is it easy to do. And I'm gonna explain my conclusions sort of step by step, so that people who have not seen any of my several hours long deep dives into the various World of Darkness settings can follow along with what the hell I'm talking about. This isn't even all of them. Also, you know, there will be spoilers here. Many spoilers, all of the spoilers really, for World of Darkness and Hannibal. Bear in mind that my analysis here only concerns the TV show by Brian Fuller. The old films with Anthony Hopkins or the books by Thomas Harris are their own interpretations of this setting. For the purposes of this, they're not necessarily the same thing, as for instance evidenced by the fact that they're the same story taking place in completely different time periods, so clearly they do not exist in the same continuity. And also, of course, I understand that I'm showing you the Pepe Silvia of it all here. I am aware that Hannibal is not secretly a World of Darkness show. The analysis just works so perfectly down to a cross-splat stat level that I cannot help myself. So first things first, the protagonist. Not the main character, the protagonist. Will Graham is a mage. Except he is not a mage, he is an enlightened scientist. And the enlightened science he practices is psychological profiling. Okay, so sidebar, in World of Darkness, mages and enlightened scientists are fundamentally the same thing. They're individuals in the process of awakening to the fact that reality is actually a consensus created by human beings and not objectively true. Things are the way they are because enough people right here and right now agree that it's the case. They believe in their own subjective reality so strongly that it manifests into actual reality, breaking the consensus. They can call lightning with a prayer and draw life force from a crystal because of their belief in that worldview. And if everyone believed that, everyone could do it. This does mean that yes, in the past, dragons existed because people believed in them. That's a whole can of worms. There is a special category of mages called enlightened scientists, and they do the exact same thing mages do, but their worldview, or paradigm as it's called, is a rational and scientific one, as opposed to one that's based on superstition and belief in supernatural forces. It posits that the world is fundamentally understandable. It's still just as based in belief in practice, and the distinction is a cultural one between mages, right? Alchemy is also rational and scientific in its process, but enlightened scientists don't do it anymore, so it's considered magic instead of enlightened science, though in the past this was different. Will is a strong believer in a paradigm built around cognitive psychology, behavioral science. The idea that you can discern the human mind from patterns of behavior even with rather little information. Think about it. He can literally go into a crime scene and then see what happened from the killer's perspective, knowing their thoughts, discerning new information this way that should be impossible to know. But he does it anyway because he believes that with his meditative practices, education, imagination, and high empathy, he can. And in terms of magical feats, this isn't even a difficult effect to create. If Will Graham was a character in a Mage game, his crime scene empathy thing would be like a Mind 1 × 2 effect, probably. His training, the being present at the crime scene, the thing where he actively focuses, those would be the tools he uses during his ritual to manifest the effect. The feathered stag, by the way, is his avatar, his genius, the guiding force that is at this point very subtle and arcane, but which drives him further into his understanding of his paradigm and to further enlightenment. It's clearly a separate entity from the thing that show fans call the Wendigo, which we will circle back to later. The stag is in essence a representation of Will himself, and that's exactly what an avatar is to a mage. Any somewhat recently awakened mage with 2 dots of enlightenment could do this. It's neither difficult nor sophisticated, but nonetheless very useful and impressive. And that's exactly what Will is. He may not be freshly awakened, but he's certainly a beginner in the arts of true magic, or rather enlightened science. It's nevertheless the thing that sets him apart from all the other people around him. The people at the FBI and the criminal psychology community. They all believe in this same paradigm, or at least paradigms very close to it, and they do use rote techniques, but they don't have the level of reality-altering power that Will does, because they're not mages. They're sorcerers, or rather extraordinary citizens. Hi again. Much like mages and enlightened scientists are the same thing with a cultural difference, sorcerers and extraordinary citizens are the exact same things along the exact same lines. Except they're not awakened individuals capable of creating new dynamic magic, but individuals who know the secrets of those magical crafts. You do need to be awakened to break consensus, but consensus is complicated. It's not the same everywhere, and sometimes even contradictory things can be true at the same time. It's not an even blanket. It's a pockmarked and warped non-Euclidean surface. In the Deep South, and specifically in megachurches for instance, faith healing is possible. It's a part of consensus. And if you know the real and true secrets of how to do it, you can do it even if you're not a mage. Mages, in their long and arduous battles with consensus, because let me tell you, consensus really does not like being broken, often develop their paradigms and encode them into reality, if you will, by getting enough people to believe in them. This is very useful for mages because having enough people who believe in their paradigm creates a reality zone wherein they can practice their magic without consensus constantly fighting against them. The paradigm thus established can often survive mages, and individuals who truly understand the actual trail blazed by these actual mages will be able to make use of the very specific paradigm they encoded into reality. Of course, a lot of non-mages then inflate these theories, add their own conclusions, just make stuff up, so very few people actually know the real secrets of any given paradigm, and even fewer actually understand how it all fits together. These people we call sorcerers when they practice magic, and extraordinary citizens when they practice enlightened science, and they they can be very powerful in their own right, standing on the shoulders of giants. They just don't break consensus in the way that mages do, and they can't make new stuff up. Will works for the FBI, as do all the people around him, suggesting very strongly that they are part of the technocracy, meaning that the technocracy is aware of Will and cultivating him as an enlightened scientist, because obviously those are huge assets. Jack, who I believe is the only person in the main cast who may have some sort of explicit knowledge that the technocracy exists, recruits Will and constantly tries to get him back in the game at many points during the show. And yeah, sure, this is him being ambitious and wanting to catch bad guys, but I'm certain that the higher-ups in the technocracy will have encouraged him to keep Will on board and drag him back as often as possible. Okay, so the technocracy is the government of enlightened scientists. It's a very powerful global organization with vast resources, with the stated goal of eliminating magic based on superstition and replacing it with science and rationalism, because they think that the chaos of magic is terrible for average people. Their project for the past few centuries has been to iron out a sort of global consensus that's the same everywhere, and they have created the bodies to prove that they are dedicated to this goal. Powerful though they may be, they are far from perfect or implacable. They're a labyrinthine bureaucracy with a lot of holes, corruption, and philosophical disagreements. And though they've done a very good job at their goal of creating a unified consensus, there's still a lot of cracks and crinkles, not to mention massive disagreements on the details as to what a rational scientific consensus should even look like. We've talked about alchemy before, and like round the turn of the 20th century, many mages believed in ether theory. It's a whole thing, you can read that up like on Wikipedia. It was an explanation for how the universe works, rational and scientific. It posited theories and you could look at them, but the technocracy decided that they didn't like it and they wanted to engineer a different consensus without it, which led many of the ether theorists to leave the technocracy and join its rival organization, the Council of Traditions. And that's why there's mad steampunk scientists in World of Darkness. I have a whole video going deep on the technocracy that you can watch, as well as a whole nother one on the Council of Nine Traditions. But you might say, well, if Will is awakened and the technocracy is aware of him, shouldn't they just have yoinked him to a space station by now to tell him what's what? No. Not necessarily. The old technocracy may have done that, but in the 21st century they have become so subtle and embedded in the world's institutions that not even most people working for the technocracy know they are working for the technocracy. If someone is awakened, and they awaken as an enlightened scientist, with a paradigm that is compatible with the consensus the technocracy wants to create, and they're already embedded in society in a position where they can teach others their paradigm, why would the technocracy interfere with this development? Why would they do anything but nurture that person in secret? Will is the golden goose for the technocracy. I believe that the FBI Behavioral Science Unit is a project by the NWO. That's the New World Order, the branch of the technocracy whose job it is to manufacture consensus and protect it from those who would deviate from it. They make people believe what the technocracy wants them to believe, and do so most effectively by actually being convincing. Though propaganda is still a big tool in their arsenal. Their most iconic agents are actual, literal FBI mirror shades agents in dark suits, so they're very embedded in law enforcement and academia, the intersection of which is the Behavioral Science Unit, to tackle a modern kink in the consensus and convince the world that monsters do not exist even in human form, and if they do, law enforcement uses science to keep you safe from them. Serial killers are unbelievably rare, but they are huge in the public consciousness. That's why the NWO has to be especially subtle. They're embedded in a pioneer field of research with public awareness, very volatile, and full of highly intelligent and discerning people who need to be convinced that it is true. This is why they have Will teaching at Quantico, so that others can learn his techniques, so they become part of consensus. Because the thing is, people want to believe in monsters. They are desperate to terrify themselves. And the monsters of this modern age are serial killers, aliens walking among us. And then you have people like Freddie Lounds who want to give people exactly that belief. Tattle crime and rags like it mystify serial killers, lend them an air of the supernatural, which is very explicitly against the consensus the technocracy is trying to create. But they can't just disappear or like brainwash Freddie Lounds. It would be suspicious if that happened. It would make people doubt. They need to defeat Freddie Lounds in the war of minds, in the battle of ideas. She is, to the higher-ups in the technocracy, the real main villain of Hannibal. Really, the whole show, by sticking to its tone and genre conventions, is an excellent window into how consensus works and how it can deviate a little bit, almost unnoticeably so, but still be generally and internally consistent enough that we just accept it. A lot of things happen in Hannibal that are entirely unrealistic. Some of the conversations are weird and overly philosophical. I'm saying some of the conversations, it's most of them at some point. Nobody talks like that. I would argue even in most television shows. There's plenty of extremely unrealistic stuff in that show. But we just shrug about all that because, well, that's just what genre is. But for people in that world, that's not just genre, it's reality. For them, in their little fold of consensus, reality truly does work in a way that is ever so slightly different from the consensus the rest of the world sees. Because consensus is essentially genre. And so everything we see as the audience is heavily colored by the specific consensus of the show. It's one of the defining battlefields of reality, if you want to put it like that. And the purpose of the FBI BSU is to manufacture consensus and hunt reality deviants in a very, very public place. Reality deviants are entities, usually people of some description, who deviate from the consensus that the technocracy is working to establish. This is usually mages who have their own paradigms, but it also includes some types of beings that the technocracy has found impossible to eradicate from reality, such as vampires, ghosts, werewolves, and fairies, because the source of their existence sort of exists outside of consensus, and thus they exist within their own sort of mini-consensus. This protects them from the paradox backlash that consensus-breaking mages have to worry about. The technocracy seeks to limit their existence and interference because obviously if you want people to not believe in werewolves, having a video of humans turning into giant direwolves or like clearly wolf-man hybrid forms to trash an oil pipeline, it's not so productive. Check out my recent deep dive into werewolf lore if you want to find out some more about them. And yes, for the purposes of this and also in general, I hold that regular humans can absolutely be reality deviants if they are a type of person doing things that the technocracy is opposed to happening. The unfortunate truth is that the public is often fascinated with these types of people because they lead extraordinary lives. This does not just apply to serial killers, it applies to various different types of strange and wild people. Because don't we all like to dream about having lives that are a little extraordinary? And here it just so happens that there is one lucky cannibal who literally feeds on that sort of fascination and finds himself excellently placed within the FBI Behavioral Sciences Unit. There are only a few killers hunted in the show whom I believe to be reality deviants of the supernatural variety, and most of them are subtle. The thing that defines them is that they have some element to them depicted in the show that seems beyond the bounds of possible reality. Garrett Jacob Hobbs from the very first episode, the Minnesota Shrike who kills girls who look like his daughter so he can avoid killing his daughter, just a guy. Regular, human guy who drinks regular human beer. Deranged as fuck, of course, but, you know, human. At least at first, because after Will kills him to save Abigail, he shows up many more times throughout the show in Will's visions and nightmares, which he thinks of as his own imagination, but which is actually insight into the supernatural truth of the world. Which leads me to believe that Garrett Jacob Hobbs becomes a wraith, and one of his passions, or perhaps one of the passions of his shadow self, involve haunting Will Graham. Wraiths are the ghosts of dead people. Not everyone becomes a ghost, not everyone who still has unfinished business becomes a ghost even, but it helps. Ghosts exist in the Shadowlands, a decayed layer of reality made up of memories, slowly sinking into oblivion. They have a very complex society designed to keep them from falling to their shadow, which is sort of their worst self made manifest. It's illegal for them to interact with the world of the living, but many are drawn to do so anyway, like Garrett Jacob Hobbs, clearly. If you want to learn more about wraiths, I have a several-hour-long deep dive on that as well. Eldon Stamets from the second episode, who yes, is in fact named after the actual real-world mycologist Paul Stamets, was a mage as well. His paradigm was also one of enlightened science, but concerning the collective intelligence network of fungi, the mycelium, which many in the technocracy hate to see. I think he wasn't particularly powerful or experienced, but he was definitely a mage. More advanced in his enlightenment than Will, even with dots in the life sphere. Probably also entropy. He actually sort of managed to bring a guy back from the dead through the mycelium, which the FBI mistakenly interprets as the guy actually somehow having survived. He's also clearly fucking mental, like in a bad way, a serial killer, and I assume had he survived, the technocracy would have spirited him away to a Horizon construct for intense brainwashing, aka therapy, before like sending him off to the progenitors maybe so he can do science there. The way things actually played out, he died. Kind of a waste, according to some technocracy superior, but when do things ever go as planned? Elliot Budish, the Angel Maker, was a mage in the process of awakening, probably gaining an understanding of the spirit sphere, which is why he could see people's auras, and imbued with a very twisted sense of justice. His story is actually emblematic of how many mages feel upon their awakening, like they're seeing some sort of deeper truth about the world, but are entirely abandoned in that process. His paradigm was one of magic, not enlightened science, with a strong biblical theme. It would have made one fucked up chorister. He is in a sense very similar to Will, who also has means of discerning and understanding other people's nature, except with a completely different approach. Tobias Budge. Oh, Tobias. Frankly, I'm not sure, but I have reason to believe he is the exact same thing that Hannibal is. Or at least something similar. But I think the exact same thing. But what is that exact thing that Hannibal is? Well, obviously, clearly, a fairy. And also a fairy. A changeling, or specifically put, a ghast. And the body of evidence I have to support this is not just vast, it's very specific. Will being a mage, sure, a lot of people could be mages. They're built to be highly interpretive. The rules of that game line are built to accommodate literally everything possible in reality and outside of it. But Hannibal being a ghast? We're talking line by line from the Changeling rules, baby, let me tell you this. By the way, a fairy in the world of darkness is a being made of pure thought. There are countless different kinds of fairy, just as there are countless different types of thoughts, all of which agglomerate in a dimension called the dreaming, which is effectively a world made out of ideas. A changeling is a particular category of fairy that has chosen to insert itself into the wheel of rebirth. Though their souls are immortal, they get born into human bodies and create a unique individual on each incarnation. Changelings, like all fae, have kiths, which are essentially species of fae. Their genes, if you will, are the tropes and stories that represent this particular type of dream being, like the high and noble Shay lords and ladies, the hedonistic satyrs, and bellicose treasure-hoarding chlorocorns. One of these kiths is Ghast, which belong to a group called Tharlane, designating kiths formed specifically of fears and nightmares. If you want a deep dive on Changeling the Dreaming, I also have a video on that. Okay, so what defines a ghast? They're born of nightmares. About clandestine organ thieves lurking unseen in the night, evolved from nightmares of secret cannibals pretending to be members of civilized society, as well as monsters masquerading as trustworthy authorities. This is literally the primal fear that Hannibal Lecter embodies as a character. It's a perfect fit. Like all kiths, they have two key special abilities called endowments. The first of which is called natural surgeon. Ghasts are perfect surgeons. They never make a mistake and can perform the most complicated procedures without a hitch. In the show, Hannibal was one of the best surgeons in America before he switched to psychology. He's always cutting people up, and he never fucks up in the process of doing so, unless it's deliberate. The other ghast endowment is called Malevolent Mists, which describes a shroud of oblivion surrounding the ghast that aligns with fate in a way that will allow them to get away with their heinous crimes. It literally erases and changes people's memories, even the memories of their victims. Miriam Lass was kept hostage by him for years and did not remember him. This happens all the time with Hannibal. None of his surviving victims, of which there are a few throughout the show, seem to remember him when appropriate. He murders a lot of people, and he's never spotted by accident. Always gets away with it. Whatever clues he leaves, because surely there must be some. A stray hair would show up somewhere. None of it is found. It takes several dedicated elite police investigators who know him personally to ever properly get on his trail, one of whom is a fucking mage, and it does not go particularly well for most of them. Still doubting? Also, like all kiths, ghasts have a vulnerability, and it's called silence of the flesh. Get this, ghasts need to eat some sort of internal organ of a victim once a week or grow highly irritable. Hannibal operates under the guise of several different serial killers to go on sprees where he specifically freezes body parts with great focus on organs, despite the risk this would pose should he ever be under suspicion. He does this because he knows the malevolent mists will protect him, and also because he needs this in order to function. He won't die without regular meat infusions, but he does need them. In addition to these abilities, he constantly gets away with highly implausible feats and gambits that are well within the purview of established fairy arts, fairy magic. Now granted, because of the malleable nature of the dreaming and its inhabitants, we do pretty much know that many more arts than the ones listed in the various Changeling rulebooks exist, so we can effectively say that anything implausible he does is an art. But that would be a bit easy, wouldn't it? The level of emotional manipulation he affects by sheer force of will, in addition to his labyrinthine intellect, the selective way in which he seems to edit people's minds, is highly reminiscent of the art of chicanery and its darker cousin, delusion. I mean, Jesus, he kills a guy and takes his identity, right? This guy. Even the job he was supposed to take. And nobody seems to really notice. Roman Fell was an art historian. Academia is well connected as a community, even like with the malevolent mists of the ghast. There is no way he never runs into anyone who didn't know Roman Fell. Shit, none of the people who ostensibly must have interviewed Roman Fell seem to notice he's a different guy. Nobody even looks that shit up on the internet. Except, of course, for that one guy who clearly is himself not human, but we'll talk about him later. Without the use of changeling art or some other form of magic, this is literally impossible. It cannot happen. Not with the internet being a thing. And frankly, not even without it either, this shit would not have flown at any point in the past few centuries. He also uses all manner of hypnosis techniques and devices that can sometimes appear outright goofy, until you realize those are bunks. That's how fairies operate. That's how they weave art. He is an accomplished hand-to-hand fighter. But some of the moves he pulls off, the speed with which he moves, not to mention his uncanny abilities of long-distance travel, suggests he has some skill in the Wayfair art, not to mention knowledge of the secret paths of the dreaming. His timing, and the timing of the many coincidences surrounding him, is absolutely impeccable. He gets a lot of stuff done when he should really not have the time for that at all. This suggests he knows the art of Kronos. I wouldn't be surprised if he had some ability over the art of Sovereign as well, given that he clearly commanded Neil Frank's tongue to choke him should he become enraged and feel aggressions rising in him. Though there might be some other ways of achieving that. And also, let's just look at the ghast. Look at this. Visually. Or would you fathom the archetypal resemblance from the official artwork, from the official book of what a ghast looks like. Now, this is just an example of what one ghast looks like. There can be a significant amount of variation, but you got the suit, the complexion, the weird eyes, the slim frame, even the facial features are vaguely reminiscent of Mads Mikkelsen in this role. Though, in fairness, this illustration is from a book that came out in 2017, the Changeling Anniversary Edition, so I would not be surprised if Mads Mikkelsen's iconic performance perhaps maybe inspired the artist a little. Ghasts as such have existed longer than that, but this specific artwork is rather new. Of course, that is not what a ghast kith changeling would look like to the human eye. Barring one or two odd features, which Hannibal certainly does have, changelings look like human beings in the real world. What we see here is not the mortal seeming, but the fey mien of a ghast, which non-changelings would only get to see in the dreaming. In order to compare like with like, we have to look at Hannibal's fey mien, which we do actually get to see extensively in the show, and it looks like this. Yeah, this is what Hannibal actually looks like as a fairy. His true appearance, which Will sees only in, get this, his dreams. When he's dreaming. AKA when his mind is in the dreaming, of Changeling the Dreaming, that in the title. There are a few exceptions where he peers past the mortal seeming in certain situations, but that is because he is a mage with the right skills to do so. And yes, I will grant you that this is indeed not the same as the sample artwork. It does look a bit different. The difference is not huge, mind you, in terms of how variable the various different kiths are and can be, but there is absolutely some deviation. Which is to be expected though, because there can be quite a bit of variety within the same kith. Every changeling is an individual, and Hannibal Lecter is everything but an average ghast. He is quite extraordinary, and I think the show hints at some excellent reasons for this. Ghasts usually travel around in groups a lot, while Hannibal is clearly sedentary and solitary, though he does team up with people sometimes, and at least in his past, in Europe, did do a lot of traveling. It is also unusual for a ghast to know the arts of Kronos and Sovereign, which he clearly seems to, as they are noble arts that the Fey nobility doesn't like non-noble Fey learning. Except Hannibal may well be a noble. In Lithuania, where he is from, he is considered some sort of duke or baron. Now, this is either because of the human part of him was born into nobility, and we don't actually learn too much in the way of specifics here, but Will does go to Castle Lecter. That's a real place. Look at this. And the family relations of the place are complicated, enshrouded in duplicitous misinformation at best. There is his Count father who does not own the castle for some reason, his Italian mother, his uncle named Robertus who has a Japanese wife and a handmaiden, a crazy guy in the basement who allegedly killed Hannibal's little sister who had an evocative name. We see almost none of these people, all of these events like decades in the past, which is why I believe that Castle Lecter is actually a freehold. And the remarkably diverse group of people inhabiting it also were all changelings. Hello again. A freehold is a special place that exists partially in the dreaming. A real-world location with a dual nature that seems entirely ordinary, or, perhaps a little extraordinary, in the real world, but is actually an enchanted location where changelings can be safe from the dangers of existing in the real world. A freehold could be a swimming pool that's actually the entrance to an underwater merfolk palace, a hole underneath the roots of a redwood tree that actually contains a vast earthen cavern filled with a small village, or indeed a spooky castle that is an even spookier castle in the dreaming. Hannibal may have been adopted by Robertus Lecter for whatever unfathomable reasons the Fae do what they do, though perhaps because it was genuinely so that a mortal brother that he had a child that happened to be a changeling, which would be unlikely, very unlikely, but not impossible, and certainly if it did happen, a fortuitous portent in Fae society. Given the dark vibe of the castle, I would assume that Robertus Lecter was Unseelie, one of those dark Fae that see humans as fruits to be harvested. Also because a Seelie noble would never have adopted a ghast, or any sort of Tharlane, into their family. Maybe the reason Hannibal became an orphan early on is entirely Hannibal's own doing. A changeling's transformation usually happens in early childhood, and you would expect a ghast to kill its parents, quite frankly. frankly. Noble Fae rarely get to inherit through family lines anymore, so Robertus may have felt as though Hannibal becoming his heir was preordained by fate and had to be realized in spite of his kith, thus teaching him noble arts. Robertus Lecter may have even been the one to teach Hannibal the art of delusion as well, a forbidden art, but one that allows a changeling to hide their true kith from other changelings and Fae, which would have allowed Hannibal to masquerade as a respectable changeling in society. Right, maybe perhaps pretending to be a she, really the noble kith, like I assume his uncle must have been. Hannibal seems to have a vast social network and many friends, all people who appreciate fine art and who could be implied to be of, shall we say, ambiguous moral character. Even though we never actually see him have much of a social life outside the show, and it would be difficult to imagine given how much time he spends just sort of being Hannibal. But from where I'm standing, all the guests at Hannibal's dinner party are clearly all changelings themselves. Either ones willing to deal with a ghast, or ones that have no idea about his true nature. But to go back to Castle Lecter, I have a few more points of evidence. First of all, we see Chio, who seems to act as a sort of like the guardian of the place. She might be a changeling, but I actually think she is Kinane, a descendant of a changeling with changeling blood, fully human as such, but attuned to the world of the dreaming, but freely able to enter and leave it as changelings can. Very useful assets to the noble Fae, who use them as messengers and guardians. She's supposed to be roughly the same age as Hannibal, but like, she's clearly a way younger. This would make perfect sense, however, if she was the guardian of a freehold, because humans and changelings that spend time in a freehold do not age. So she would obviously age a lot slower than Hannibal. The same may be true for the man she holds in a cage as punishment for killing Hannibal's sister, though here my main point is that he is completely insane, which is also something that happens to regular humans if they spend too much time in a freehold, though that does depend on the nature of the freehold and how they're treated there. I don't know if the freehold itself is still active, if it still exists. I think Will never actually enters the proper freehold, only its real-world counterpart, Castle Lecter, or like a house near Castle Lecter. I don't even think he goes in the proper castle at any point. So it's entirely possible that all the rest of the changelings that raised Hannibal, and with whom Hannibal grew up, at least the ones that did survive, are very much still alive in there. But a lot of that is based on speculation, filling in the gaps in a convenient way. I would rather present you with my final and strongest piece of evidence, Hannibal's lifestyle. First of all, his ethics. Yes, he is a crazy cannibal, an intelligent sociopath. But one of the main reasons why he kills people is because he finds them rude, which is an extremely in-character thing to do for unseelie and even Thale Fae. He also surrounds himself with fine art and inspired creations of the human soul. He is himself an artist, a craftsman of many disciplines, not just a world-class chef. He appreciates fine art and architecture, consumes it like it is the juice of life itself, which, of course, to Fae, it is. All that shit is real, cold, warm, hard, soft, ethereal glamour. Okay, so glamour is, in essence, pure creative energy. It's passion and emotion, intellect, inspiration, a sense of the interesting, the possible, and the impossible. Fae need glamour because they are made of it, as is all of the dreaming. It literally keeps them from vanishing into non-existence, and it also fuels their powers. The main source of glamour are humans, and because changelings are part human, they have a great advantage in that they can produce part of the glamour that they consume by pursuing their own creative, pursuits. Creative pursuits are, in this case, loosely defined, as what actually constitutes usable glamour varies from kith to kith and individual to individual. Being nightmare creatures, many Thalain actually feed off fear and anxiety, which many Fae would find little useful, but a varied diet is always a good idea. Something we learn very early on about Hannibal Lecter, and which becomes more and more common later on, is that he loves encouraging and helping other serial killers. In fact, he does it in the very first episode. He has a tendency to act as a copycat killer, egging other killers on either by provoking them or paying homage to their work. Sometimes he has a direct line to them, as is the case with Randall Tier, who used to be Hannibal's patient before becoming a serial killer as part of his inspired process of self-actualization. It is heavily implied that this is not the first time he's done this. He has a habit of bringing the killer out in his patients. And anyone who knows how changelings work can see he's practicing epiphany, cultivating glamour to harvest later. This is the one thing most changelings spend most of their time doing. And in a way, he does it very ethically, at least according to the moral framework of the Fae. The art he draws glamour from is murder, especially if it has some sort of artistic merit. And he does it himself as well, which is called rapture, where he creates his own glamour to harvest. But by provoking and encouraging other killers, he is musing. He is practicing reverie. He is being amused to the serial killers, helping them along their creative journey, which is the most sustainable way of cultivating and harvesting glamour. He clearly isn't above the more unethical ways of stripping glamour from mortals. It's what he seems to be doing a lot with Abel Gideon, who, being veritably insane, is an absolute fountain of glamour. He's also cultivating Abigail Hobbs, keeping her glamour on tap, walking and chewing bubblegum at the same time. Who knows what he's been doing to Miriam Lass all these years? And while he's in Europe, he's doing it with Bedelia du Maurier. Margot Verger is another intermittent example. But I don't think we ever see him practicing rhapsody, the practice of infusing a mortal with glamour so they will create one magnum opus and then be forever burnt out creatively. This is in line with his orange and blue morality because he does seem to be driven by some sort of code. And the desire to harvest glamour in a somewhat bountiful and sustainable way may be that. The entire show is Hannibal putting in a lot of work to cultivate Will Graham by turning him into a killer. And quite frankly, why wouldn't he? Forget Abel Gideon. Will Graham is a mage. And if there is one thing in the universe that is a white hole filling everything around itself with glamour, it's a mage. Now, of course, that's a spectrum, because that's just some mages. Others can be apocalyptic black holes of banality that strip away the face selves of changelings in minutes, especially enlightened scientists. So banality is a concept I have come to refer to as toxic in real life even. And it's basically the opposite of glamour. It's, hyper-order, demystification, structurization, restriction of the possible, death of whimsy, seriousness, if you will. Metaphysically, the seriousness of adulthood, which consists mostly of pointless tedium that kills your dreams. It used to be every day was made of freedom and the possibility of adventure, and gradually this disappears from our lives as we become adults, turning us into cogs of the capitalist machine where there is no place for our spontaneity or ambition. Our lives get flooded with banality. It kills our drive, our creativity, it makes us into boring grown-ups who hate fun and everyone who has it. Since you're probably aware that not all adults are like this, levels of banality can differ a lot from person to person, much like levels of glamour. Banality is poison to Fae, essentially. Being exposed to too much of it can lead to their death, or in the case of changelings, their undoing, which is when the part of you that is Fae is stripped away and you become essentially just a human, forgetting all your whimsical and wonderful adventures in the realm of the Fae. For most changelings, this happens in their 30s, assuming they awakened as changelings as children. The Fae part doesn't die, per se, it hibernates and is released back into the dreaming and eventually into a new body once the remaining mortal human that was once changeling dies. After that, it reincarnates, but because changelings often have no good memory of their lives from previous incarnations, you could say that the individual changeling still died by undoing. So why is Hannibal dealing with the technocracy at all? since they are so very dangerous to his existence as a changeling? Well, aside from the fact that he clearly enjoys a bit of danger, while the enlightened scientists here do not believe in fairies, they do believe in something else that Hannibal Lecter very much is: serial killers. And by that I mean serial killers of the most cinematic and hyper-amped up variety. They spend a lot of time thinking about them, a lot of time having strong emotional reactions to them, dealing with the ramifications of having them in their lives. You might go so far as to saying that their entire worldview revolves around this type of alien living among humans. And that's the whole point of being a changeling in the first place: shielding yourself with a coat of banality in order to survive and effectively operate and even thrive in the banality-ridden world of humans. And while yes, for most changelings, that sort of clinical and terror-filled FBI environment would be loaded with banality, one changeling's banality is another changeling's glamour. In my deep dive on changelings, I describe a hypothetical boggin tax accountant. Doing taxes would be an injection of pure banality for most changelings, but there are people who really enjoy numbers and math and administrative problems to solve. They delight in those sorts of puzzles. So to them, that's not a source of banality, it's a source of glamour. As an aside, there is a strong source of banality for Hannibal, and it's his own indignity. He needs his creature comforts, his respect as a psychologist, his aesthetic environment. During his court case to be declared insane, he takes on a lot of banality, a calculated risk, which he then later tries to limit somewhat by reclaiming his professional respect when he thoroughly disproves his own insanity defense by ripping into Dr. Childen. Alana Bloom, even not knowing he is a changeling, uses the threat of his banality against him very effectively when she threatens to take away his access, his books, and his sanitary facilities. And for Hannibal Lecter, who primarily feeds on fear and the sense of power it gives him to be a monster hiding in plain sight, being in that FBI world would be a feast, even if he didn't have a mage whose full attention he draws more and more, and who sees him for what he truly is, who believes so strongly in him, who is obsessed and infatuated with him. For basically the whole show, Hannibal is supercharged with glamour, and I will go so far as to say that this is the reason why he looked a lot older. You see, like, sort of deader, more corpse-like in the first season, when he's only just entering this world, like he's done his regular glamour cultivation shit. Then, in later seasons, where the whole world revolves around him, he looks like this. Much more healthy, much more alive. But he also needs to be careful with many of his fey powers, because he does not want to trigger disbelief and make the whole paradigm come toppling down. That would be disastrous to his efforts at cultivating Will Graham as glamour on tap. And honestly, having a mage, even a weak one like Will, dedicated to your existence, have his whole paradigm revolve around you, that shit is unbelievably powerful. Mighty fairy kings would kill for that. And Hannibal not only has it, but because of the specific relationship he has with glamour and banality, very few other changelings would even be able to challenge him for it. Not that that makes him any less protective of Will. And by cultivating Will, I don't just mean manipulating him into becoming more and more of a serial killer, imprinting his own self over Will. He also takes an active hand in growing him as a mage. The whole thing, where he essentially gives Will viral encephalitis, he induces it, makes him go insane, is his attempt at pushing him further up the path of ascension, make him more powerful as a mage. I don't know how well he understands mages and how they work, but it seems to me like he's not just trying to induce sieges, but is seeking. Of course, he miscalculates severely, and what he actually induces is a quiet instead. But hey, sometimes you gotta risk something. Okay, so a seeking is a sort of intellectual journey, a deep meditation, an awakening of the mind, a spirit quest, if you will. It's a period of rest, often outright coma, wherein the mage practices heavy introspection. It guides mages to a higher level of understanding of both their paradigm and the malleable nature of reality. In game terms, once your game master gives you a seeking, you are allowed to purchase the next level of arete or enlightenment, which is basically the core stat that defines a mage. It's like the measure of magical power, if you will. A quiet is very much not that, but a state of disconnect from reality, a form of magical insanity that can have some severe consequences. Will suffers this, and within the paradigm lens of our show, it is portrayed as viral encephalitis. And it makes perfect sense that Hannibal's attempts would do this. Quiets happen when a mage is too strongly associated with one of the aspects of the metaphysic trinity. Will suffers from madness, which is associated with the aspect of dynamism. However, he is an enlightened scientist, aligned with the aspect of stasis more than anything. Hannibal is a Fae, and Fae are very strongly associated with dynamism. Hannibal just overplayed his hand and infected Will with his nature, thereby unbalancing him metaphysically. Ironically, the abatement of Will's quiet later plays a part in his actual seeking, which happens when he is imprisoned in the Baltimore State Hospital for the Criminally Insane. We see him have these long periods of contemplation, in an almost comatose disconnect from reality. His avatar is present, and he emerges from it having gained a greater understanding of himself, his mission, and the world at large. He's noticeably more powerful after this, more self-assured, more in control of his abilities. Hannibal, ever the chess master, is playing an extremely dangerous game, using his vast knowledge to pull off some risky-ass gambits because the rewards are so immense. And in doing so, of course, he runs into a variety of other supernatural beings. So circling back to Tobias, I'm pretty sure he was not just a Fae, but also a ghast, not unlike Hannibal in nature. He and Hannibal basically immediately recognize each other as serial killers, though I say changeling. Tobias is also an odd sort of ghast, but he follows the ghast instincts of forming groups. Hannibal sees a kindred spirit for a moment, but realizes he could butt in on the thing he's got going with Will, and so kills him. Now, killing a changeling is big business. You don't just do that shit. It nets you banality. Hannibal seems to think he has a good grip on that whole economy though. He regularly loads up on and later discharges or mitigates banality, as many changelings are forced to learn to do. The other non-human characters Hannibal runs into certainly include Kate Purnell, clearly an NWO higher-up concerned with a law-based consensus. Now, we don't see much of her, but her actions are pretty extreme and make a lot more sense when you think of her not just as a bigger cop, but as someone trying to keep an experimental NWO unit from derailing and endangering the greater legalistic consensus she subscribes to. Another relatively minor character who is clearly magical is Anthony Dimmond. I mentioned him earlier, who shows up in season 3 for a brief spell as the only person who sees through Hannibal's chicanery and recognizes that he is not, in fact, Roman Fell. He spots Hannibal right away in the first episode of the 3rd season as someone interesting, and I think this is because he is also a changeling. Not a ghast, mind you. I'm not entirely sure as to his kith, but gun to my head, I would say Eshu. He seems to travel a bit, stick his nose in here and there, show up in places when something momentous or interesting is about to go down, and he fucking loves to hear himself talk, clearly. I suspect he didn't ken Hannibal's true kith, but took him for some other kith because of Hannibal disguising himself. Hannibal, of course, knowing that Eshu show up in stories to play pivotal roles in them, clearly saw Dimmond as a threat, which is why he dispatches with him very quickly. A fate Dimmond had no reason to suspect would befall him, because again, most changelings are reluctant to kill other changelings. Hannibal then even turns him into an artful murder in order to heal some of the banality he incurred killing him. Now, a very special case to me is Mason Verger, who is not only clearly a mage, but he also has a Will Hannibal Mage Changeling situation going on for himself, except the power dynamics are exactly the other way round. Mason could probably also be described as a sort of enlightened scientist, though the paradigm he believes in is that money makes the world go round and makes everything possible. Which is a great example of how enlightened science does tend to include some really weird and esoteric philosophy. This is, of course, not weird at all. The Syndicate is a convention of the technocracy that is all about the magic of economics, and they do feature some of the quirkiest and, dare I say, unmutual enlightened scientists in the technocracy. They love themselves an unorthodox approach that borders on reality deviance. They love a little tongue-in-cheek joke. How closely Mason is actually associated with the Syndicate, I cannot say, but he would certainly make a good fit for them. Perhaps to a certain extent also the progenitors, because what he sort of does with this money magic seems to concern genetics and breeding a lot. It appears that he experiments with transplanting a fetus of the Verger bloodline, which also appears to be part of his paradigm, into a pig, though presumably this fails, and some of these experiments, they inevitably do fail. Two other instruments he uses to manifest his magic that are popular with the Syndicate are social domination, primarily through fear. Most iconically, I find when he makes himself this refreshing martini with a child's tear. That is some deranged mage shit. And having competent staff that can accomplish the impossible. And speaking of that staff, let's talk Cordell, the Changeling in the equation. Cordell has been with Mason for quite some time and seems to be quite loyal and devoted for him for no reason, really. It doesn't really make that much sense that he would be, except of course the reason that his master is a mage that supplies him with tremendous amounts of glamour and uses his vast wealth to provide a cover for all his operations. Unlike Hannibal, he is not a Ghast though, or in fact a Tharlane at all, but an ill-gotten Boggin, perhaps warped by Mason Verger. Now, as a reminder, Boggins are generally kindly changelings who delight in taking care of tedious work for others and being of service to their community. For Cordell, this is exacting the minutiae of cruelty and torture upon Mason's victims, making art of it himself, doing all the dirty work and basking in the appreciation of his master. He also seems to be a keen judge of social situations, and even has a plump body shape associated with Boggins. Very much an exceptional example of his kind, but the World of Darkness is made of those fascinating exceptions. And of course, who could forget the Tooth Fairy, the Red Dragon, Francis Dolarhyde. I struggled with him for a while, I must admit. Not because I didn't know what to assign his clearly supernatural attributes, but because there were so many options as to what he could be. Kinda like how archaeologists don't know how they built the pyramids, because they're not sure which of the many methods that ancient Egyptians could have plausibly utilized, they actually did utilize. I thought of a changeling, maybe one of in the process of awakening to its nature, but that usually is way more abrupt. And though there is probably a dragon kith, it's not in any of the rulebooks to my knowledge. Especially the thing where he eats the original William Blake watercolor. Very much a changeling thing to do, but it's also in character for a whole different type of being. I think Francis Dolarhyde is a Fomor, a human possessed by a bane. Okay, so hello again. Whole new can of worms. Fomor is a term that does exist in the vocabulary of changelings, but here I mean it in the vocabulary of werewolves, where it means something entirely different. Werewolves are embedded with a spirit world called the Umbra, which is connected to the dreaming of the changelings, but fundamentally a separate thing, and which is inhabited by spirits. Everything that exists has a spirit at every level. Even and especially conceptual stuff. And one of the great categories of spirit are the triadic spirits, direct incarnations of the spiritual triad, the wild, the weaver, and the worm. Banes are triadic spirits aligned with the worm, and though most werewolves do not refer to them as such, you can imagine them kind of like demons. Spirits of destruction and malignance keen on inhabiting elements of the real world, especially humans. These banes have mutated those humans into Fomori, giving them supernatural powers and making them agents of destruction in the worm's apocalyptic design. Francis Dolarhyde is a perfect target for a bane to possess. He is dejected, insecure, socially isolated, very inward focused, aggressive, violent with poor emotional control, and a big fat sociopathic streak. Those are exactly the traits that invite a Bane in. Banes don't just corrupt people out of nowhere. They seek out corruption and worsen it, driving those on dark paths even deeper into the black. They turn people into killers by realizing the killer's potential inside them. The Bane's efforts are hindered, really, by Reba, showing kindness and love to Francis, slowing down his transformation, making him doubt his path, though the Bane does win out in the end. Targeting happy families and the social order they represent is the exact kind of thing a Bane would do. The dragon imagery fits very well with the worm, and Dollarhide's whole journey is one about becoming stronger and more possessed by the Bane, which is ultimately increasingly pulling his strings. All of the weird visions that he has are glimpses into the Umbra. His strength and his senses are clearly augmented to be superhuman. In the final fight, Will and Hannibal, both of whom are trained and experienced combatants, struggle to take him down. And here we do see his draconic wings even, aspects of his final form, which can manifest because this house is not actually located in the real world. That's right, I think it's actually a freehold as well. Not a particularly powerful one, perhaps not a particularly valuable one, but it's in the Dreaming, which is one of the reasons why nobody was ever able to find what Hannibal did there. My only evidence for this is the dragon wings, of course, but I also find that the whole place is a sort of dreamlike texture. I don't know quite how else to describe it. I think that is just a descriptor that applies. The place, the landscape, it doesn't feel fully real when you look at it. Also, there is a comment on how the cliffs receding more and more through erosion, and it's presented as a more urgent issue than it should be. Hannibal has not been here in quite some time and has been unable to maintain his freehold. And the FBI search for him over the years, the search for this specific location, has exposed it indirectly to waves of banality that are strongly eating away at its foundation. Aside from Will's dreams, this is the only time we get a glimpse at one of the many alternate dimensions of reality in this show. And yeah, everyone else, all the other characters, human. Exceptional humans, certainly, which is kind of the thing about World of Darkness. Most of the time, when you don't look at the large-scale background plot conflicts of cloned hyper-wizards assaulting train stations in deep space, it's very grounded. And a competent human or two in the wrong place at the wrong time can do a number with most types of supernatural creatures. It's ultimately not about vampires and wizards. It's about exploring the human condition by pairing it with the contrast of the inhuman, especially its dark sides, but the beautiful things as well. All the little idiosyncrasies that make us who we are, all the rules and their exceptions. That's World of Darkness. And that is, to a large extent, Hannibal too. So it makes perfect sense for most of the characters to just be human. Except Childen. It doesn't make sense for him to be human. I don't know what the fuck is going on with him. I have no reason to assume he is anything but human. But he survives ordeals like he's a vampire with fortitude. He gets shot in the fucking face, right? It's incredible the damage this man survives. Maybe he's a clone. Right, that's like my theory, perhaps. Maybe he's one of those like shitty new androids they replaced hit marks with, and every time he dies, the technocracy prints a new one, puts the old memories in, and that's that. He certainly does do a lot of weird stuff that seems to serve no one's design in particular, which is exactly how the ascended masters of the technocracy would operate. He sure as shit wouldn't be aware of it. He's not aware of many things. But yeah. Thank you for watching this video. Like, comment, subscribe, share this to your relevant communities. Consider maybe buying some of my beautiful merchandise or my short story collection. There's still something else coming soon. It's in the works. And in that spirit, this has been fun, actually. Let me know if you like this sort of thing. I might do more of it, provided a piece of media comes along that fits as well as Hannibal does. I love this sort of slightly supernatural media, you know, where you're not quite sure. See you around, cunts.